Welcome to our Good Friday service. We're sharing this online worship experience with you from the sanctuary here at Friends Congregational Church. This will be similar to a Tenebrae service that extinguishes candles as we remember the story of Jesus' final days in Jerusalem and the events of his betrayal, trial, crucifixion, and death and burial. The readings come from the Gospel of Matthew, and the translation we are using tonight is from the Inclusive Bible, the first egalitarian translation. You're invited to follow along with the readings that you'll find in the worship guide. You can access the worship guide by clicking the link on the post for tonight's service. I will be one of the three readers, along with Pastor Dan and the Reverend Amy Klinkowski, the pastor for United Campus Ministry. Also, when any group speaks, like a crowd of onlookers or the disciples, you are invited to read aloud with us in unison. There will be special music in the service, as well as a few times when you will be invited to sing. Tonight is somber, but it is not meant to beat us down. It is meant to carry us together into the story, so that we can give witness to the love of Christ that was so big for this world and so much of a threat to the powers of authoritarianism and oppression that Jesus was killed for it. But we know that love always wins, and that the only way to Easter morning is through Good Friday. Let us remember and worship together.
When Jesus entered the temple, he drove out all those who were selling and buying there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those selling doves. He said to them,
"Scripture says, 'My house is called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of thieves.'"
Those who were blind or couldn't walk came to him in the temple, and he healed them. When the chief priests and teachers of the law saw the wonderful things Jesus did throughout the temple area, especially when they heard the children shouting, "Hosanna to the heir, to the house of David," they asked him, "Do you hear what the children are shouting?"
"Yes. Have you never read, from the mouths of children and nursing babies, you have brought forth praise?"
After leaving them, Jesus went out to Bethany to spend the night.
majesty, in lollipop ride on to die. O Christ, thy triumphs now begin, o'er captive death and conquered sin. Ride on in majesty, the hosts of angels in the sky look down with sad and wondering eyes to see the approaching sacrifice. Ride on in majesty, in lollipop ride on to die. Bow thy meek head to mortal pain, and take, O God, thy power and reign.
Jesus told the disciples, Passover starts in 2 days, and the chosen one will be handed over to be crucified. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest Caiaphas. They planned to arrest Jesus under some pretext and execute him. But not during the festival, they agreed, or we might have a riot on our hands.
Now when Jesus was in Bethany, at the house of Simon, who had leprosy, a woman approached Jesus with an alabaster jar of very expensive ointment. She poured it on his head while he reclined at the table. The disciples, witnessing this, were indignant. What a waste!
This could have been sold at a high price, and the money given to needier people. Jesus, aware of their concern, said, "Why do you upset the woman? She has done me a good deed. You'll always have poor people with you, but you won't always have me. When she poured the oil on my body, she was preparing me for burial. The truth is, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the world, she will be remembered for what she has done for me."
One of the 12, the one named Judas Iscariot, went off to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give me if I hand Jesus over to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he looked for an opportunity to betray Jesus.
On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came up to Jesus and said, "Where do you want us to prepare the Passover for you?" Jesus told them to go to a certain person in the city and say,
"The teacher says, 'My appointed time draws near. I am to celebrate the Passover in your house.'"
The disciples did as Jesus ordered and prepared the Passover supper. When it grew dark, he reclined at table with the 12. And while they were eating, he said,
"The truth is, one of you is about to betray me."
They were greatly distressed and started asking him in turn, "Surely it is not I, teacher?" Jesus replied,
"The one who has dipped his hand into the dish with me is the one who will hand me over. The chosen one will go as the scriptures foretold, but woe to the one by whom the chosen one is betrayed. It would be better for that one never to have been born at all."
Then Judas, who was betraying Jesus, said, "Surely it is not I, Rabbi?" Jesus answered,
"You have said it yourself."
During the meal, Jesus took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to the disciples. "Take this and eat it," Jesus said. "This is my body." Then he took a cup, gave thanks, and gave it to them. "Drink from it, all of you," he said. "This is my blood, the blood of the covenant, which will be poured out on behalf of many for the forgiveness of sins. The truth is, I will not drink this fruit of the vine again until the day when I drink it anew with you in my Abba's kingdom.
Journey to Gethsemane, go and feel the tempter's power, your Redeemer's conflict see, watch the anguish of this hour, do not hide or turn away, learn from Jesus how to pray.
Jesus then said to them, "Tonight you will all fall away because of me, for Scripture says, 'I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered.' But after I have been raised, I will go to Galilee ahead of you."
Peter responded, "Though all may fall away because of you, I never will." Jesus replied,
"The truth is, before the cock crows tonight, you will deny me 3 times.
Peter said, "Even if I must die with you, I will never disown you." And all the other disciples said the same.
Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to the disciples,
"Stay here while I go over there and pray."
Jesus took along Peter, James, and John and started to feel grief and anguish. Then he said to them,
"My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Please stay here and stay awake with me."
Jesus went on a little further and fell prostrate in prayer.
"Abba, if it is possible, let this cup pass me by. But not what I want, what you want."
When Jesus returned to the disciples, he found them asleep. He said to Peter,
"Couldn't you stay awake with me for even an hour? Be on guard and pray that you may not undergo trial. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." Withdrawing a second time, Jesus prayed, "Abba, if this cup cannot pass me by without my drinking it, your will be done."
Once more, Jesus returned and found the disciples asleep. They could not keep their eyes open. Jesus left them again, withdrew somewhat, and prayed for a third time, saying the same words as before. Finally, Jesus returned to the disciples and said to them,
"Are you still sleeping? Still taking your rest? The hour is upon us. The chosen one is being betrayed into the hands of the sinners. Get up. Let us be on our way. Look, my betrayer is here."
While Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, accompanied by a great crowd with swords and clubs. They had been sent by the chief priests and elders of the people. Judas had arranged to give them a signal. "Whomever I embrace is the one," he had said. "Take hold of him." He immediately went over to Jesus and said, "Shalom, Rabbi," and embraced him. Jesus said to Judas,
"Friend, just do what you're here to do."
At that moment, the crowd surrounded them, laid hands on Jesus, and arrested him. Suddenly, one of those who accompanied Jesus drew a sword and slashed at the high priest's attendant, cutting off an ear. Jesus said,
"Put your sword back where it belongs. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. Don't you think I can call on my Abba God to provide over 12 legions of angels at a moment's notice? But then how would the scriptures be fulfilled? which say it must happen this way. Am I a robber that you have come armed with swords and clubs to arrest me? Every day I sat teaching in the temple precincts, yet you never arrested me.
All this happened in fulfillment of the writings of the prophets. Then all the disciples deserted Jesus and fled.
Those who had seized Jesus led him off to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the religious scholars and elders had convened. Peter followed at a distance as far as the high priest's residence. Going inside, Peter sat down with the guards to await the outcome. The chief priests, with the whole Sanhedrin, were busy trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus, so that they might put him to death. They discovered none, despite the many false witnesses who took the stand.
Finally, two came forward who stated, "This man has declared, 'I can destroy God's sanctuary and rebuild it in 3 days.'" The high priest rose and addressed Jesus. "Have you no answer? What about this testimony leveled against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest then said to him, "I order you to tell us under oath, before the living God, whether or not you are the Messiah, the firstborn of God." Jesus replied,
You have said it yourself, but I tell you, soon you will see the chosen one seated at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven.
At this, the high priest tore his robes and said, "Blasphemy! What further do we need to have of witnesses? You yourselves have heard the blasphemy. What is your verdict?" They responded, "He deserves death." Then they spat at his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped Jesus, saying, "Play the prophet for us, Messiah. Who struck you?"
While this was happening, Peter was sitting in the courtyard. One of the attendants came over and said, "You were with Jesus the Galilean too, weren't you?" But Peter denied it in front of everyone. He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." When Peter went out to the gate, another attendant saw him and said to those nearby, "This one was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again he cursed and denied it. "I don't know him."
A little while later, some bystanders came over to Peter and said, "You certainly are one of them. Even your accent gives you away." At that, Peter began cursing and swore, "I don't know the man." Just then, a rooster began to crow, and Peter remembered the prediction Jesus had made. "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Peter went out and cried bitterly.
At daybreak, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took formal action against Jesus to put him to death. They bound him and led him away to be handed over to Pilate, the governor.
When he saw that Jesus had been condemned, Judas, who had betrayed Jesus, felt remorse. He took the 30 pieces of silver back to the chief priests and elders and said, "I have sinned. I have betrayed innocent blood." "What's that to us?" they answered. "That's your affair." So Judas flung the money into the sanctuary and left. Then he went off and hanged himself. The chief priests picked up the silver, observing, "It's against the law to deposit this in the temple treasury, since it is blood money." After some discussion, they used the money to buy potter's field as a cemetery for foreigners. That is why that field, even today, is called Blood Field.
Follow then to Pilate's hall, where the Lord of life arraigned, crowned with thorns and mocked by all, faithfully this pain sustained, greater still than shame or loss. Jesus now must face the cross.
Then Jesus was arraigned before Pontius Pilate, the governor, who questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied,
You say that I am.
Yet when Jesus was accused by the chief priests and elders, he made no reply. Pilate said to Jesus, "Surely you hear how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus did not answer Pilate on a single count, much to the governor's surprise.
Now, on the occasion of a festival, the governor was accustomed to release one prisoner, whomever the crowd would designate. At the time, they were holding a notorious prisoner named Barabbas. So when the crowd gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you wish me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, the so-called Messiah?" Pilate knew, of course, that it was out of jealousy that they had handed Jesus over. While Pilate was still presiding on the bench, his wife sent him a message.
Have nothing to do with that innocent man. I had a dream about him last night, which has been troubling me all day long.
But the chief priests and elders convinced the crowds that they should ask for Barabbas and have Jesus put to death. So when the governor asked them, "Which one do you wish me to release for you?" they all cried,
Barabbas!
Pilate said to them, "Then what am I to do with Jesus, the so-called Messiah?"
Crucify him!
"Why? What crime has he committed?" Pilate asked. But they only shouted louder,
Crucify him!
Pilate finally realized that he was getting nowhere with this. In fact, a riot was breaking out. Pilate called for water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, declaring as he did so, "I am innocent of this man's blood. The responsibility is yours." The whole crowd said in reply, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." At that, Pilate released Barabbas to them. Pilate had Jesus whipped with a cat o' nine tails, then handed him over to be crucified. The governor's soldiers took Jesus inside the praetorium and assembled the whole cohort around him. They stripped off his clothes and wrapped him in a scarlet military cloak. Weaving a crown out of thorns, they pressed it onto his head and stuck a reed in his right hand. Then they began to mock Jesus by dropping to their knees, saying, "All hail, King of the Jews!" They also spat at him. Afterward, they took hold of the reed and struck Jesus on the head.
Finally, when they had finished mocking him, they stripped him of the cloak, dressed him in his own clothes, and led him off to crucifixion. On their way out, they met a Cyrenian named Simon, whom they pressed into service to carry the cross. upon arriving at a site called Golgotha, which means skull place, they gave Jesus a drink of wine mixed with a narcotic herb, which Jesus tasted but refused to drink. Once they had nailed Jesus to the cross, they divided his clothes among them by rolling dice. Then they sat down and kept watch over him. Above his head, they put the charge against him in writing: "This is Jesus, King of the Jews."
Two robbers were crucified along with Jesus, one at his right and one at his left. People going by insulted Jesus, shaking their heads and saying, "So you are the one who was going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Save yourself, why don't you? Come down off that cross if you are God's own." The religious authorities also joined in the jeering. He saved others, but he cannot save himself. So he's the King of Israel. Let's see him come down from that cross, and then we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now. After all, he claimed to be God's own. The robbers who had been crucified with Jesus jeered at him in the same way.
From the hands it came down, from the side it came down, from the feet it came down, and ran to the ground. Between heaven and hell, a teardrop fell in the deep crimson dew. The tree of life grew, and the blood gave life to the branches of the tree, and the blood was the price that set the captives free, and the numbers that came through the fire and the flood clung to the tree and were redeemed by the blood. From the tree streamed a light that started the fight. Round the tree grew a vine on whose fruit I could dine. My old friend Lucifer came, fought to keep me in chains, but I saw through the tricks of 666. And the blood gave life to the branches of the tree, and the blood was the price that set the captives free, and the numbers that came through the fire and the flood clung to the tree and were redeemed by the blood. From his hands it came down, from his side it came down, from his feet it came down, and ran to the ground. And a small inner voice said, "You do have a choice." The vine engrafted me, and I clung to the tree. And the blood gave life to the branches of the tree, and the blood was the price that set the captives free. And with the numbers that came through the fire and the flood, I clung to the tree and was redeemed by the blood. From his hands it came down, from his side it came down, from the feet it came down, and ran to the ground. At noon, a darkness fell over the whole land until about 3 p.m. At that hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice,
Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?
This made some of the bystanders who heard it remark, "He is calling for Elijah." One of them hurried off and got a sponge. He soaked the sponge in cheap wine and said, sticking it on a reed, tried to make Jesus drink. The others said, "Leave him alone. Let's see whether Elijah comes to his rescue."
Once again, Jesus cried out in a loud voice. Then he gave up his spirit.
Suddenly, the curtain in front of the Holy of Holies was ripped in half from top to bottom. The earth quaked, boulders were split, and tombs were opened. Many bodies of holy ones who had fallen asleep were raised. After Jesus' resurrection, they came out of their tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many.
The centurion and his cohort, who were standing guard over Jesus' body, were terror-stricken at seeing the earthquake and all that was happening, and said, "Clearly, this was God's own."
A group of women were present, looking on from a distance. These were the same women who had followed Jesus from Galilee as ministers to him. Among them were Mary of Magdala, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's children.
When evening fell, a wealthy man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had become a disciple of Jesus, came to request the body of Jesus. Pilate issued an order for its release. Taking the body, Joseph wrapped it in fresh linen and laid it in his own tomb, which had been hewn out of a rock. Then Joseph rolled a huge stone across the entrance of the tomb and went away. But Mary of Magdala and the other Mary remained sitting there, facing the tomb.
The next day, the one following the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees called at Pilate's residence and said, "We recall that while he was still alive, the impostor made the claim, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' Therefore, please issue an order to keep the tomb under surveillance until the 3rd day. Otherwise, Jesus' disciples might go and steal his body and tell the people, 'Jesus has been raised from the dead.' This final deception would be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard. Go and secure the tomb as best you can." So they went to seal the tomb and post a guard.
Sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Sometimes it causes me to tremble.